Hi, I'm Jessica Clemons, and this is The Witching Hour. It's like an extension of New Rockstars. We'll explore all the facets of horror with different hosts of New Rockstars every week, diving into a scary movie that we want to share with you. So let's talk about 2006 Pan's Labyrinth. In 2006, Guillermo del Toro released his sixth prominent studio feature after making Cronos, Mimic, The Devil's Backbone, Blade 2, and Hellboy. He created Pan's Labyrinth. Taking place in 1944, 5 years after the Spanish Civil War, we follow a young girl named Ophelia who moves with her pregnant mother to live with her cruel stepfather, Captain Vidal. As she struggles with the brutality around her, Ophelia is visited by a faun who tells her she's the lost princess of an underground kingdom. Who wouldn't love that? Me. Because I'm a woman. To return, she must complete 3 dangerous tasks. While Vidal hunts rebels and her mother's health steadily declines, Ophelia navigates a dark magical world that mirrors the violence of her real one. After Cronos, Guillermo del Toro built a strong career through a mix of independent projects and studio-backed films. Coming just 2 years after Hellboy, Pan's Labyrinth fell firmly into the independent category. After Hellboy's success, Guillermo del Toro was offered any superhero movie. He debated whether to make Pan's Labyrinth or a big blockbuster movie again. When he allegedly left his notebook with all his sketches for Pan's Labyrinth at a cab and a taxi driver returned it to him, he then told God he's gonna make Pan's Labyrinth. So let's cover the idea. Guillermo del Toro wrote Pan's Labyrinth in or around 1993. It was a story of a pregnant woman who arrived at a mansion in Spain. Her husband worked for the mansion owner, restoring the home. The woman fell in love with a faun in the labyrinth and they made love. Later, the faun asked for the blood of her firstborn to open the gate and let her into the magical kingdom to be with him. But as the story evolved, he included a girl, the daughter of the pregnant woman. And little by little, he realized it was more interesting to tell the magic through the girl's eyes and to toss out the love story completely. Pan's Labyrinth was intended to be a sister story or a companion piece to Guillermo del Toro's 2001 film, The Devil's Backbone, a film that follows Carlos, a boy sent to a secluded orphanage where a mysterious unexploded bomb sits in the courtyard and a ghostly child wanders the halls. As Carlos uncovers the truth behind the ghost and the dark motives of the orphanage's caretaker, the film becomes both a supernatural mystery and an allegory for the wounds, trauma, and corruption left in the wake of the Spanish Civil War. That movie and Pan's Labyrinth are set 5 years apart. Now, from 2001 to 2006, in 5 years, the world changed completely after 9/11, and everything Guillermo had to say about brutality and innocence and childhood and war changed dramatically. Because of that shift, he became interested in crafting a companion to The Devil's Backbone that reflected not just a different moment in Spanish history, but a different moment in American history. In the script and visual storytelling, Guillermo del Toro explores fascism, authoritarian violence, the power of disobedience, and truth-telling nature of fantasy, often using fairy tale logic. He contrasts violence and magic to show how the real world suppresses Ophelia's instinct for imagination. Del Toro cites a 19th century idea that we should treat children as ambassadors of a higher culture, learning from them rather than trying to reshape them. To him, adults corrupt what is naturally pure, while children hold intuition and virtues that are often too ignored or just lost. There are a lot of different perspectives to draw from this movie, and Guillermo encourages you to find all of them on your own. My favorite framing is the belief that children understand the world in ways adults no longer can. So how do you go about making something like this, a Spanish-speaking film rated R with no well-known stars? How would you even get this movie off the ground in America? This ambitious 19 million production faced major setbacks. When they started producing, finances collapsed 2 or 3 times, including a chief investor pulling out at the last minute. They ended up saving the project by structuring it as a co-production between Mexico and Spain, but not before dropping their own dime because they still had to pay the storyboard artist and the designers, and Guillermo was in the middle of creating assets like the scrapbooks of photographs for the film. Guillermo del Toro began funding the film himself. His producing partner was Alfonso Cuarón from Roma, or Y Tu Mama Tambien, and Frida Torres Blanco, and Cuarón immediately contributed half the budget. Their agreement was that if the production went over budget, they would give up their producer salaries, and they did. Guillermo also surrendered his director's salary, a decision he says he never regretted. So along with Guillermo, Alfonso Cuarón also co-produced the movie along with partners Frida Torres Blanco and Tequila Gang's Bertha Navarro. Spanish Telecinco, through its production arm Estudios Picasso, put up most of the money, and the Estudios Picasso chief editor-in-chief served as an executive producer. They later secured US distribution through Picture House, the young joint venture between HBO and New Line Cinema, though even the distributor was unsure how an R-rated Spanish-language dark fantasy would play with American audiences. Picture House president Bob Burney set his sights on what they referred to as a three-pronged marketing campaign that would target specific moviegoers, appealing to the young male genre audience through primarily TV commercials and promos at San Diego Comic-Con. He stated how they're more affected by expensive promotions, whereas an art audience they did through editorial and reviews, but the Latino audience they recognized responded well to print ads and radio, so they did a lot of promos via TV spots, posters, newspaper ads in Spanish, and also just mainstream radio, KROQ, and stuff that has a very heavy Latino audience. Despite the odds, the film's release outperformed every expectation. Backed by Guillermo's growing fan base from Hellboy and his earlier works, this graphic adult fairy tale with no major stars became the highest grossing Spanish language film ever released in North America. He said the blend of fantasy and political repression made the story powerful and emotionally honest, making viewers want to see it. Some say it's the creatures being so damn scary, beautiful, or downright perverse. Some say it's the labyrinth itself as a moral and symbolic journey, but whatever it was, it killed it. The movie that took 19 million went on to earn 83.9 million worldwide. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival to a 22-minute standing ovation, one of the longest in festival's history. Also, the film was a smash during awards season. Pan's Labyrinth dominated the technical categories at the 79th Academy Awards. It also earned 3 BAFTAs, a Hugo Award, and holds a 95% score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 98 out of 100 on Metacritic. It went on to widespread love as one of Del Toro's finest works and one of the greatest fantasy films ever made. Personally, I love it. Its visual imagination, its creatures, its blend of fantasy and history, but beyond the stunning visuals and unforgettable creatures, what truly sets Pan's Labyrinth apart is how Guillermo del Toro uses fantasy to explore real-world horrors. Which leads us into chapter 3, Humanity in the Face of Fascism. Guillermo del Toro has said in an interview that he was both horrified and fascinated by the level of brutality and ruthlessness of the fascists after meeting Spanish exiles living in Mexico in his early 20s who shared their experiences under the Spanish Civil War. Guillermo has explained, in conjunction with this historical reality, I was trying to uncover a common thread between the real world and the imaginary world, which I found one of the seminal bloodlines within fairy tales, the bloodline of choice. I thought it would be compelling to counterpoint an institutional lack of choice, which is fascism, with the freedom of choice that the girl faces in this story. So obedience is seen as the tool of fascism, and disobedience is what makes us human. Throughout the film, Ophelia disobeys the fawn, her mother, the captain, and even the pale man's rules, which shows that while defiance can lead to tragic consequences, it can also be an act of moral freedom. In this world, disobedience may cost you your life, but it is also the only path to reclaiming your humanity to escape fascism. For instance, we watch the Doctor choose to disobey Captain Vidal to spare the rebels suffering, even though it means sacrificing his own life. Guillermo has acknowledged that the idea in these 20 or so paces he takes into the rain right before he's killed, he imagines those are the most profound, liberating moments of his life, the moments when he feels most alive, most himself. If that's true, then the film validates his choice. His disobedience isn't just rebellion, it's humanity. Although that seems sad, that's just how the world works. It's still grim, and I like that Guillermo offers that idea that fairy tales can still be very, very brutal. It keeps the story a bit grounded in reality in a weird way, just shadowed by mysticism. This was important for building the world, the fantasy, and the monsters while keeping the fairy tale logic. Ophelia's journey takes her into a place where the rules of morality and courage are tested in exaggerated magical ways, like most fairy tales are. The movie is peppered with references to other fantasy movies and works, novels, or short stories. His key influence, the science of fairy tales that came out in 1891, which classified fairy tales and their oral origins and broke down the reoccurring myths, the myth of choice, the ritual of not eating or drinking while you're in the fairy world, facing very often figures that look like the frog. Other clear fairy tale examples are when Ophelia first meets Captain Vidal. This moment is directly and openly tied to Charles Dickens. He knows that when Vidal tells Ophelia use the other hand, it's a direct reference to David Copperfield. In Dickens' novel, young David meets his stepfather for the first time and politely offers his left hand, and the stepfather immediately corrects him. It's the other hand, David. It's a small gesture that displays just an adult asserting dominance, forcing a child into rigid, arbitrary rules. The story parallels also Anderson's The Little Match Girl by portraying a young girl who uses her imagination to survive a violent world, finding in fantasy the love and dignity denied to her in reality. There's Wizard of Oz tropes, though, much lighter in Wizard of Oz than in this movie. Alice in Wonderland, Oscar Wilde, Little Red Riding Hood, and the Big Bad Bad Wolf, all of them. There's even a stint when Ophelia is moved into the attic, which Guillermo del Toro said he liked in Shirley Temple's 1939 film, A Little Princess. It helped frame Ophelia with magic in her heart, but living in a place where the world around her is just collapsing. When visiting the Pale Man's chamber, it's another classic fairy tale trope. 3 doors that are distinct, and the girl must choose the right one. She disobeys the fairies, who are pointing to the middle door. Guillermo wanted to highlight the theme of disobedience again in the movie, noting how it takes different forms throughout. She does it the first time, it's right. She does it the second time, a fairy gets eaten. Storytelling itself is central to Pan's Labyrinth. It's the foundation on which the fairy tales are built, and Guillermo uses it to shape the world in a traditional sense. At the captain's dinner, Carmen, Ophelia's mother, recounts the story of her husband, Ophelia's father, a tailor who died. We're led to wonder if the Captain Vidal, ordered his death, though the truth is never fully revealed in the movie. It's up to you to decide. For Guillermo, though, the tailors and cobblers were historically the storytellers, traveling from town to town, sharing their tales. And that's why he made Ophelia's parents, her mother and father, part of this lineage of storytellers, weaving the tradition of oral storytelling into the film's very characters to build the fantasy world. You gotta love it! There's also a small detail that I always overlooked, but it was intentional in framing the fairy tale world, the magical pollen just floating around Ophelia. Introduced at the very beginning of the film, when she first encounters the insect, it appears whenever a mystical creature is nearby, especially in daylight. It sort of signals that she's crossing the veil between reality and fantasy, but it was very important that it was during daylight. As in The Devil's Backbone, he wanted the first encounter with the fantastic to occur in daylight, grounding the magic in the real world. Guillermo has explained that making the magical tangible comes from treating it as something ordinary rather than making it with filters, harp music, or other special effects. By presenting the labyrinth in this way, the fantastic feels real, allowing the audience to experience it as part of the same world. So building this magical world, a lot of things are actually expanded upon in Pan's Labyrinth, The Labyrinth of the Faun by Guillermo del Toro and Cornelia Funke. It's the novelization of the film, but they get into the vast, deep lore behind the film's myths, which aren't as detailed in the movie. The novelization has specific chapters that draw you in, like The Sculptor's Promise, which tells the story of a sculptor commissioned to create statues of the queen and the king throughout the upper world, hoping that when the princess sees it one day, she'll be reminded of who she is and return to them. When that never happened, he sculpted a statue of the faun, who wandered Earth in search of her but never found her. On his last leg, he plucked out his eye, left it on the forest floor, and turned to stone beside the king and queen statues. This is that same eye that Ophelia discovers at the very beginning of the movie that alerts that she's been found. The book also explains the story of the labyrinth itself, built by a wealthy man's soldiers for his wife who had been found in the forest with no memory of who she was. It's later implied that this woman was the missing princess who had lost all knowledge of her identity and would later find it again in the middle of the labyrinth as Ophelia. Another chapter highlights the razor and the knife, emphasizing the symbolic contrast that we see in the story. The razor brings out the worst in man while the knife protects people. While these details are fascinating, the movie doesn't require you to read the novelization to understand it. The film itself shows how the two worlds, fantasy and reality, can coexist at first without forcing the audience to know every backstory. And I won't get too much into the novelization, but I'm gonna visit it again when I'm talking about the horrendous Pale Man. If you're watching this channel, then you can probably relate to trying to fall asleep right after watching a scary movie. It doesn't always work. You get super attuned to every weird little creak and groan your house makes that night, and then you're up for hours. Even if you don't have the heebie-jeebies, you might have a hard time falling asleep. Dream by Beam can help with that. Dream by Beam helps me fall asleep fast, stay asleep, and actually wake up rested. Before Dream, I was lucky to get 5 to 6 hours of sleep a night, and even then I was tossing and turning wide awake with my brain on overdrive. Now, I drink 1 mug of Dream and I'm out in 20 minutes and on my way to 8 hours of real quality sleep. No racing thoughts, no jumping at shadows, none of that. And in the morning, I don't have that groggy hit snooze 5 times feeling. I wake up clear and ready to go. Plus, I don't crash mid-afternoon anymore. I'm focused, more productive, and I don't need that second coffee at 3 p.m. Dream changed my nights and my days. Dream is made with melatonin, magnesium, L-theanine, and reishi mushrooms, all natural ingredients that support every stage of sleep, especially deep REM. There is melatonin-free versions available as well, and it tastes like rich hot cocoa, like it's legit good, and it's become my favorite part of winding down at night. This is your last chance to shop Beam's Black Friday sale with up to 50% off for a limited time. This is Beam's biggest sale of the year and the best deal that we've shared. So don't miss out. Just go to shopbeam.com/witchinghour, and thanks again to Beam for sponsoring our channel. And so we move on to fantasy versus reality. One of Guillermo del Toro's best draws is the distinction between fantasy and reality. Like life and death, the two shape each other, and I feel Guillermo del Toro uses that same logic to build a world with fantasy and reality. In Pan's Labyrinth, many moments remain deliberately questionable, leaving us unsure what is real or whom we can trust. What interests me most, though, are the points where both worlds begin to mirror one another and bleed together at the edges. For example, you can see the fawn's head in the banister. They branded the fawn's head throughout the movie. You'll see it a lot of times. Is he there or isn't he? This tree resembles the fawn and echoes the fallopian tubes, and the entrance of the tree is not exactly subtle to what that represents either, so I don't really need to get into it, but you know what I mean. The bloody book then forms a design into the fallopian tubes, but the fawn's horns are still echoed there. They together just symbolize and represent guidance and the violent forces of life. But we still see how the real world and fantasy mirror one another and they come to life. We see Ophelia leave behind her dress before entering the tree, but Guillermo del Toro wrote it with the idea that that dress represents any adult concern. Sure, she doesn't want to stain it, but he wanted her journey into the fantasy world, into her inner world, to happen without being weighed down by the adult burdens. Del Toro points out how the fantasy and real world begin to contaminate each other through objects and motifs in both realms. For example, the key is crucial in both the fantasy and the real world, and later the knife serves as a dual role as well. Guillermo has Martin Hernandez incorporate a metallic tone when she grabs the key that you'll hear again with the knife. Even spaces like the dining room are echoed across both worlds, representing the Pale Man's banquet and Captain Vidal's evil party. These mirrored elements create the sense that two realities are intertwined. He also links the Rebels' cave to the Labyrinth's central pit, framing them as magical forest-like creatures, constantly just emerging from the tree surrounded by pollen connected to the mystical world. Del Toro intentionally designed the mandrake to mirror the unborn child, and the mandrake's magic begins to influence the real world. When it comes to life, it echoes the mother's movements, and we see her healing in tandem with his vitality. And if you look closely, the mandrake appears even in the mundane kitchen scenes disguised as vegetables that Mercedes chopping. Del Toro explains that he wanted this ambiguity. The magical world could seem imaginary, confined to Ophelia's perception, or it could be real. As the story progresses, though, it becomes increasingly clear that Ophelia's encounters with magic are genuine, and her transformation is truly taking place. A big question in Pan's Labyrinth is whether the magic is real, and this comes into focus at the very end when Captain Vidal finds the chalk. We, the audience, are led to believe that Ophelia ran down the stairs and took her little brother away, but realistically, though the movie doesn't really question it, Guillermo asks, how could she have done that? How did the chalk get there in the first place? In the director's commentary, he explains, it's important to know that now the magical world becomes real for me. How did the girl get from above to the captain's lair? There were guards outside the door. Her door was locked. She was in the attic. So the answer is she drew the magical door in the wall. And this moment reinforces that the magical world is not just Ophelia's imagination. She just left the chalk down there after sneaking through a magical door. This contradicts Ophelia's ending a bit. Some viewers might argue that the captain saw Ophelia talking to no one before shooting her, but Guillermo insists that no, that proves it's not in his head. One of my favorite takeaways and a key theme of this movie is the idea that children understand the world in ways adults no longer can. Mercedes once believed in fairies, while Ophelia's mother refused to see the mystical. Their disbelief comes from having been forced to live a harsh reality, losing the imagination that Ophelia experiences every day. In Pan's Labyrinth, fantasy doesn't stop at reality, and reality doesn't stop at fantasy, though we can't ignore the horrifying monsters that make us fear them. Captain Vidal represents evil in the real world, while the Pale Man, whom he constantly mirrors, represents the evil lurking below in the fantasy one. So let's talk about these creatures. Guillermo del Toro wanted to represent political power within the creatures. He explained the Pale Man came to represent the church in its consumption of children. Originally, the character was just an old, emaciated man with loose skin, but del Toro removed his face, making it more symbolic of the institution itself. To make it even more striking, he ordered them to remove the face of it and place its little eyes on a little plate platter, just like the statue he saw as a kid in church who had her eyes in the platter and blood pouring out of her eyes. Oh! Finally, he shaped the fingers like peacock feathers that could spread and move, completing the Pale Man's horrible depiction. He's also mentioned wanting to echo both a church-like atmosphere and the chilling feeling of a concentration camp, like the shoes piled up in the corner. And this ogre, a classic fairy tale figure, feeds not on the ordinary food, but on innocent children, making it a perverse and horrifying figure. In the novelization, the Pale Man's origins is detailed in the chapter titled The Boy Who Escaped. Known as the Child Eater, he wandered in the woods in pursuit of children. As a child, he began killing with insects, and then birds, and then moved on to his mother's cats. His first victim was his younger brother, whom he loved and envied at the age of 13. Later, he worked for a priest of the Spanish Inquisition, harming more people until his own eyes could no longer bear to witness his own actions. His eyes fell from their sockets, and he carved holes in his hands to wear them in his palms. A fun detail from that story, the Child Eater always used a silver dagger with a gold handle for his murders, the same dagger that Ophelia has to get in the film. As for the fawn, Guillermo del Toro said that this was more difficult to design. He wanted him to feel very masculine, but not aggressive. Sinuous and commanding with a rock star quality. Del Toro even explained that this masculinity was important to contrast with Ophelia's feminine energy, creating tension between her and the larger-than-life archetypal figures and encounters throughout the story. He called them Jungian archetypes. These are universal symbols representing guidance, danger, and moral challenge, allowing the story to resonate on both a fantastical and a psychological level. And I love that the detail that the Fawn gets younger and younger as the story progresses. The end of the movie was Doug Jones's first day as the Fawn, and it is his youngest stage in the makeup. His hair is now reddish and his eyes are completely unclouded. His chest is clean and free of roots and moss, and his teeth are straight and beautiful. Guillermo wanted ambiguity in both the Fawn and the fairies. You have to question whether they're good or whether they're bad. It's very important that they're never fully one or the other, because in classical mythology, a fawn is a neutral creature that represents nature. Only in America is the movie called Pan's Labyrinth. It was Spanish. In Spanish, it was originally The Fawn's Labyrinth. The fawn is meant to be the force of both creation and destruction, and Guillermo wanted him to remain deliberately questionable. As for the fairies, I never thought about this until I read the novelization, but the fairies in Pan's Labyrinth aren't actual fairies. Ophelia asks if they are, and they shapeshift to look like what she wants. The fairy design was created by DDT, the special effects company that actually worked on Hellboy, and if you watch the director's cut of Hellboy, in the corridor scene where the agent brings pancakes to Hellboy for the second time, the scene actually opens with the pickle jar of fairies. And then there's the frog. Guillermo described the frog scene as a nightmare to shoot. The giant puppet was supposed to move, but it was just too heavy, so they had to adapt the set. Half the frog is a puppet, half CGI, and the VFX team blended them seamlessly, though the vomit shot went through more revisions than anything else in this film. Guillermo also worked with the composer Martin Hernandez to add subtle metallic tones, like I mentioned earlier, linking the key to magical moments between the real and fantasy worlds, especially the frog's lair in the cold outside, highlighting the contrast between the two realms. That wasn't the only technical feat that they faced and had to overcome. Every detail, from the sound to the VFX, the lighting, and the atmosphere, was crafted to pull us deeper into Ophelia's fairy tale. The film uses transitions and wipes to tell its story visually in ways you might not even notice. One of my favorite examples is how it connects motherhood and death. Guillermo del Toro emphasized the first time we see the magical world, it's presented in cold colors, and the first warm colors come through the belly of the mother. The transition itself is a horizontal wipe, and we move through root-like walls in the mother's belly into the first fantasy sequence, where a new color palette fades away, warm golds and reds and scarlets. Later in the bathtub scene with the fairy, another horizontal wipe visually links the fantasy and the real worlds, reinforcing their subtle connections. The film also uses vertical wipes, which mostly move from left to right, like the turning of pages in a book, and these help distinguish the two parallel stories, the harsh reality and the magical fantasy, while keeping them independent at first. As the film progresses, however, the world begins to intertwine, with shapes and colors from one spectrum colliding and blending with the other, emphasizing the growing overlap between fantasy and reality. In Frankenstein, Guillermo used a limited color palette to convey different things. Green symbolized nature, blue represented man, and red signified motherhood in the quest for eternal life. Now, the color palette in this movie is meant to define the two worlds. The fantasy world is warm, rounded, and almost uterine. It's meant to echo the belly of the mother and feel safe, intimate, and alive. In contrast, the real world is cold, harsh, and rigid. Rust, gray, cold greens, and blues dominate, with mostly straight lines and sharp angles. The only rounded elements outside the fantasy world are gears or circular motifs that connect to the girl's perspective, subtly tying her imagination to the otherwise rigid reality. Guillermo went on to explain, and if we did our job right, then you start getting this green palette. You have the blue outside world, and you have the golden magical world, and then you have this nether world, which technically belongs to both. We accentuate the greens on the wardrobe of the girl and the fawn and in the environment, and you can see how it all blends together like a monochrome palette of green-blue hues. Guillermo and his team also made deliberate choice to saturate the colors, even though period films usually lean toward desaturation. They use Kodak Vision stock for vivid greens and rich tones, with art direction and lighting enhancing the effect. Certain scenes are monochromatic, like the golden glow around Ophelia's dress, where the fabric, light, and gels all reinforce the warmth of the fantasy. Every color choice, every shade is designed to make the fantasy tangible and emotionally resonant, while still contrasting it it against the cold, brutal reality. They also use a special night filter called Still Blue, which has a high green component. By lighting the moss with this filter, the greens pop against the blue night tones, giving the pit a subtle magical glow and enhancing the scene's otherworldly feel. Another way the film heightens tension is through the constant moving of the camera, a technique that Guillermo began with the Frankenstein DP Dan Lawson. Guillermo said, "Now I tried to stage the world and the fantasy world differently. I tried to stage the fantasy world with a little more elaborate, playful, and active camera moves than the fascist world. So it's a little bit more playful camera work for Ophelia, like young Victor in Frankenstein." And if that wasn't enough technical brilliance to add to create a visually detailed story, they married wardrobe and set design and camera angles to tell the story and create a pair of burning wings behind Captain Vidal on purpose. Guillermo even emphasizes the role of sound in immersing the audience. He says he learned a lot, not just from films, but from actually playing video games. He even cites an influence from Pink Floyd's The Wall, referencing the prologue to Is Anybody Out There, where he layered multiple elements to build a crescendo into a female scream, heightening the tension and connecting the sound to the emotion in the story. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more behind the scenes and details that Guillermo wanted to convey and symbolize, but this all brings us to the final chapter, Pan's Labyrinth's legacy. Pan's Labyrinth is a stunt. It's such a spectacle. Pan's Labyrinth has left a long-lasting legacy as a dark, intelligent fairy tale for adults and children, mainly adults, by blending historical events with fantasy. And Guillermo del Toro showed that imagination can carry moral weight, explore disobedience, and reflect the human capacity to resist oppression. Its iconic creatures, lush colors, palettes, and seamless mix of practical effects and CGI continue to inspire filmmakers, proving that fantasy can both be emotionally powerful and intellectually great. Taking its subtle tracing of real-life artistic inspiration from people like Francisco Goya, Arthur Rackham, and Edmund Dulac, some golden age fairy tale illustrators made it even better, made it more a little bit historical, if I will. I like that the idea that this fantasy isn't a version of escapism like I want it to be, but it's more about human resilience. And to explore that through a labyrinth is just remarkable, brilliant. I love it. Guillermo said, "I think that one of the essential meanings of a labyrinth is that it's full of twists and turns to the left, to the right, in a convoluted way to reach the inevitable center. The labyrinth can mean the labyrinth inside the girl's head, where the fawn lives, or the historical labyrinth where the captain is trapped. But the labyrinth, like a symbol, cannot be closed to a single meaning, because then the symbol becomes a cipher." And I love symbols because of their ambiguity. At times, it feels like a moral arena here in the labyrinth. Even the entrance with a Latin inscription roughly translates to "In your hands lies your destiny," but still it's up to the viewers. However, I do like that Guillermo also acknowledged, "I didn't want the girl to have a safe choice in the movie," because in essence, the tests aren't about passing or failing. She actually fails 2 of the 3 tasks. What truly matters is how she approaches them, her bravery and her self-reliance, and the way her spirit remains intact. Pan's Labyrinth continues a long tradition of dark, child-centered stories like A Nightmare on Elm Street that embrace some brutal, sometimes horrifying truths of fairy tales, which we need in this world. And I love that about Guillermo del Toro facing it. Go watch Pan's Labyrinth, go watch Kronos, go watch The Devil's Backbone, and then go watch Frankenstein, and then go at Guillermo del Toro and tell him Jess sent you, and also tell him about the shirt that I have of him. Make sure to subscribe to The Witching Hour for more horror movie talks and analysis videos. Follow me at Lulu Clemons, and I'll see y'all freaks later.